How are you guys today? Anybody get to go outside and enjoy the pretty weather? Okay, so I hear that the I need to figure out how to make that sound stop. Participant, why is this not giving me the option to do that? Oh well. Hang on. There we go. Okay, we're working again. All right, so when we last spoke, we were talking about the trachea. Does anybody have any questions about this slide and the information on this slide about the trachea? No questions? Okay. These are just pictures, histology, most of the stuff you're going to see in the lab practical, of the lecture exam. Questions about the two main bronchi or the carina? Okay. What about the tracheobronchial tree? So you guys do understand that the bronchia, bronchi, thank you, it was coming out eventually, and how they sort of branch off, right? So you've got the main bronchi that branch at the carina, and then they branch off into the lobar or secondary bronchi. The lobar branch off to segmental or tertiary bronchi. The segmental or tertiary bronchi branch off into bronchioles. The bronchioles branch off into terminal bronchioles. Now, that is not the end of the branches. It is, however, the end of the conducting zone branches. Okay? There is another branch that comes off of the terminal bronchioles that we call the respiratory bronchioles. They are part of the respiratory, respiratory system. Okay? If you turn the lungs upside down, your bronchi actually look like trees. That's why we call it that. Okay? You need to know the branches of the bronchi. What is the difference between the conducting system and the respiratory system? Participation question. Participation question number 1. What is the difference between the conducting system and the respiratory system? Lakin.
The conducting system just moves air in and out when the respiratory is actual gas exchange.
Yes, exactly. The conducting zone is responsible for ventilation, moving air in and out of the body. And the respiratory system, the respiratory zone, is for gas exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Does the respiratory system, why am I echoing? Does the respiratory system involve external or internal respiration?
External?
Yes, external. It is external because the air that we are exchanging is with the outside environment, the atmosphere. Okay? All right, moving forward. Any questions about bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction? All right. Moving into the alveoli. At this point, we have left the conducting zone and we have entered the respiratory zone. Okay, the respiratory zone starts with the respiratory bronchioles. There are some alveoli on the respiratory bronchioles. There are not many, but there are some, which is why we include it in the respiratory zone and not in the conducting zone. Okay, the alveolar ducts are branches off of the respiratory bronchioles, and each alveolus opens up from an alveolar duct. Okay, now if you look, I'm drawing on the computer. Hang on a second. Let me blow this picture up a little bit. Make this a little easier. Okay. If you look here, you have alveolar ducts here and here. Okay? Try a different color. Those alveolar ducts feed into these alveolar sacs. Okay? The alveolar sac is basically a connection point between multiple alveoli. Do you see that? It's like if you, here's an analogy some of you might understand. If this space is one of those dorm rooms over at Momentum, then the alveolar sac is the shared space that each bedroom or alveolus connects to. Does that make sense? Did that analogy help anybody? Or did y'all already get it and I just wasted my time? Okay. All right. Get rid of that. All right. So, are there any questions about anything here? Other than what I just explained? Okay. To redraw this whole thing. Moving forward. What about the structure of the alveolus? Questions about the type 1 or type 2 pneumocytes? When you see the word pneumocyte, what is the phrase? What are the words that come to mind in your head? Pneumocyte equals well, pneumo is lung. You're right, Norma, about that. Cyte would be
cells.
It's maintaining.
Cell. So pneumocytes would be lung cells or cells that maintain some sort of function in the lungs, right? Each of these cell types have a very specific job. Okay, type 1 pneumocytes, gas exchange, carbon dioxide out, oxygen in. Okay. Type 2 pneumocytes produce surfactant. Does everybody understand what surfactant is and what its purpose is? Caricia. If you think about the alveoli as a bowl, okay? So I have this bowl, and inside of this bowl, I have water. Okay, so I'm gonna cut this in half. So now when I look at my alveolus, let's do that in red because I'm gonna need the water. Hang on. So when I look at my half of my alveolus, in here I have water, right? Now, one of the properties of water is surface tension, right? Do we all remember what surface tension is? It's the attraction between basically the hydrogen bonds, right? Pulling on each other and causing that tension. Well, this water in here is going to pull on the walls of this alveolus. Okay? And if we don't have anything to relieve some of the surface tension, it will actually pull the walls of the alveolus in and collapse that alveolus. Okay? If the alveolus collapses, then what happens?
It can't do a gas exchange?
It can't do gas exchange. So we've now limited lung function. Okay? Because each alveolus is responsible for gas exchange, and if we start eliminating alveoli, we lose some function in our ability to do gas exchange. So surfactant works a little bit like dish soap. Okay? If you put a drop of dish soap in this water, it's not going to completely eliminate the surface tension, but it is going to lessen the surface tension. Just enough that alveolus is able to stay nice and round. Does that make sense? Okay, so these cells, these guys here that look sort of like fried eggs, those cells are responsible for producing the surfactant that prevents the alveoli from collapsing. Okay? The other cells that are in here, these little flat guys that exist all along here, along the edge, those are just for gas exchange. They are part of the respiratory membrane. Does that make sense? Okay. Because that way I don't...
Can you just explain that just a little bit? I'm still kind of confused about that.
Okay, forward. Speaking of the respiratory membrane, any questions about the respiratory membrane? What? Hang on. I don't know what's happening. Okay, let's try this again. It appears to be frozen. What is happening here? What is happening? You guys can't see anything. Hang on a second. Okay, so back here where we were. Anybody have questions about the respiratory membrane? Oh, come on, computer. What is happening here? Nope, we're getting there. Hang on. It's just super laggy. I don't know why it's lagging so hard today. Too many things open, maybe. Okay. So... I'm gonna have one of those.
Can you repeat the question, please?
I can. What is the first part of the respiratory membrane that an oxygen molecule will encounter as it crosses the respiratory membrane? All right. So, oxygen is going to... I don't know why I've got such terrible lag today. Come on. Oxygen is going to start in the alveolus. It's going to cross the alveolar fluid, the epithelium, the basement membrane, the interstitial space, all the way into the capillary. And eventually the computers will catch up. Come on. Man, this is making me crazy today. Oh, here we go. Okay. Now, what about carbon dioxide? What is the first part of the respiratory membrane that carbon dioxide will encounter?
The capillary endothelium.
The capillary endothelium, the pulmonary capillary endothelium. So CO2 is going to go in the opposite direction. Okay? So it is really important that you know the parts of the respiratory membrane and which order they would be encountered by which molecule. Okay, by oxygen or carbon dioxide. Any questions about that? Moving forward. All right. We're going to talk just very briefly about the muscles of respiration. Okay? When you ventilate, when you bring air in, we call that inspiration. When you move air out, we call that expiration. Okay? Both of those happen as a result of the change in the size of the thoracic cavity as a result of muscles contracting or relaxing. Okay? So the biggest muscle that we're going to deal with is the diaphragm. And so there are images here, but I'm going to draw a nice simple figure here. Okay? So we're going to have our trachea, our bronchi, and our lungs. Okay? And then we have our thoracic cavity. Ooh, that's too big. Way too big. Broad-shouldered. Here. Okay. And we have, I'm going to do this one in blue just so you can see the difference, the diaphragm. Okay. Now, is that diaphragm relaxed or contracted? Lakin.
Relaxed.
It is relaxed. Okay? The diaphragm is a funny muscle, right? We always think of a muscle getting shorter or smaller when it contracts, but the diaphragm, when it's relaxed, looks sort of like a bell. Okay? When it's relaxed, it looks like a bell. When it contracts, it flattens out. Okay? So what we care about is the amount of space in here. Okay? So when that diaphragm contracts, hang on. When that diaphragm contracts, what's going to happen is what? Somebody tell me what's going to happen while I'm drawing this picture. Anybody? Sydney.
The volume decreases?
When the diaphragm contracts, does the volume decrease or increase? Which one is bigger? This space or the space on the other one? So this is A, this is B. Which one has a bigger volume? Bigger space?
So it's B.
B, yes. So when the diaphragm contracts, the cavity, the thoracic cavity, gets bigger. Okay? Because the thoracic cavity gets bigger, guess what else gets bigger?
The lungs.
The lungs get bigger. Okay? If the lungs get bigger, then the alveoli inside of the lungs will get bigger. Everything stretches, okay? And most of this is a function of the diaphragm contracting and flattening out and making that thoracic cavity bigger. Okay? Do y'all understand that part of this? Because this is going to come into play in a few minutes and be really important. All right. There it is. All right. So we're going to talk about inspiration versus expiration. Forward. Do we all understand the structure of the lungs itself? The base and the apex and what the hilum is and the different lobes. I am not going to ask you to identify the fissures, but you do need to know the lobes. I am not going to ask you to identify the bronchopulmonary segments associated with each lobe. Okay, so if you look at this diagram, I'm not going to ask you to identify all of these different segments. All you need to know is the superior, the middle, and the inferior lobes. Okay? Can get everybody remembers the pleura, the pleural cavity and the membranes and all of that stuff, the mediastinum. Anybody have questions about this? Let me go back. This is just another picture showing you the same thing. Okay. So, okay, hang on a second. Remember that I told you that most of this is related to whether or not it's related to the size of the cavity. Okay? Now, the muscles of inspiration are going to somebody's not on silent and it sounds like a TV's on in the background. Thank you. Okay, so the muscles of inspiration are going to cause the thoracic cavity to get larger. They include the diaphragm and a few other muscles. You should know which muscles. I'm not going to ask you to label them. I'm not going to ask you to identify them as, where they are, but you should know when you see them that they are muscles of inspiration. Okay? Is A or B depicting what the thoracic cavity would look like during inspiration? Caitlin?
And B does.
Yes. So B would be inspiration, because the thoracic cavity has gotten bigger. We're going to talk about how that works in a minute. So that would mean that A would more closely resemble expiration. Okay? The thoracic cavity gets smaller, and therefore air will move out of the body. So again, you should be able to recognize the muscles that are associated with expiration versus inspiration. Is everybody clear on that? Okay. Okay. All right. Now, we've already talked about this once. Okay. If volume goes up, what happens to pressure?
Goes down.
Tyra.
They're inversely related, so if volume goes up, then pressure goes down.
Yes. So that would then mean that if volume goes down, then pressure would go up. Okay? This is the main premise that drives your respiratory system. Specifically, it's the main premise that drives ventilation. Okay? So, if you're talking about moving air, air is always going to move from high pressure to low pressure. Always. Okay? Now, in order for this to work, we have to have multiple pressure to compare, which we'll talk about in a minute. I need to reorganize this PowerPoint. All right. When we do lung function tests, what we measure is pressure, air movement. Okay? Well, volume of air. And we call that spirometry. Now, if you were in the labs in person, you would be actually doing spirometry. I think there was a spirometry lab in the virtual lab stuff that I gave you guys to do. Does everybody understand the differences between volumes and capacities? Somebody explain to me the difference. Tyra.
I'm sorry, my hand was still raised.
Oh, okay. Caitlin.
I actually just have questions about this slide.
Okay.
So, in human terms, why is this all like important, I guess?
So okay, so let's look at the diagram, because the diagram will help you, the graph will help you understand this, okay? Measuring lung volumes and measuring pulmonary capacities are very important. They're really important. Think about in terms of COVID, right? People who have COVID have respiratory infections. Respiratory infections limit your ability to move air. Correct? Those limitations will show up in a spirometry reading. Okay? So let's look at this. Okay? So there's two things that you want to pay attention to. A volume is a single measurement. Okay? A capacity is a combination of measurements. Okay? Now, let's look at our volumes first, and then we'll talk about how they relate to our capacities. So, sitting there right as you are right now, not thinking about it, just breathing in and breathing out as you're writing, you are breathing your tidal volume. Okay? It is your normal inhalation, exhalation, just when you're sleeping or when you're sitting and just kind of hanging out. Okay? And it's depicted by these waves here. And you see that they are very even and they are very equal. Okay? That is your normal everyday breathing. Okay? Now, everybody take a big deep breath in. As far as you can. All the way in. That amount of air that you just breathed in is your maximum inspiration. The maximum amount of air that you can actually pull into your lungs. Okay? The measurement of that is basically how much air you pull in above your normal tidal volume. That we call your inspiratory reserve volume, or your IRV. Okay? Now, same general idea. Take a normal breath in and then blow out all of the air that you can possibly blow out. That is your maximum expiration. Okay? It is measured as the amount below your tidal volume. Okay? And we call that your expiratory reserve volume. Now, is it possible to blow out all of the air that is contained in your lungs at any given point?
No,
Why not?
because you would be dead.
Why?
Because you can't like vacuum seal everything out.
Right. So what would happen to my lung if I blew all the air out?
It would collapse.
It would collapse. My lung would collapse. Okay? So there is always air left in your lungs. And that is what we call your residual volume. Okay? It's usually around 1,200 milliliters. 1.2 liters. Okay? Now, what happens to my inspiratory reserve volume if I have an asthma attack?
Wouldn't it lessen because you can't breathe as deep?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So it would cause my inspiratory reserve volume would be lower. I would have a harder time pulling air in. Now, that would also mean that my tidal volume plus my inspiratory reserve volume would be smaller. And we call that my inspiratory capacity. So tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume equals inspiratory capacity. Okay. How many of you have ever seen someone post-surgery, or maybe you've come out of surgery yourself, and one of the things they make you do a lot after you've been intubated is what?
This is a total guess because I have never seen it, but is it like breathing therapy?
Well, yes, they'll do breathing therapy, but they'll make you cough. Right? They make you cough. Now, would a cough affect my inspiratory reserve volume or my expiratory?
Expiratory.
Expiratory, right? So if I'm not able to cough, like if I have a respiratory condition and it hurts when I cough, and so I can't move that air out, that's going to mean that my expiratory reserve volume has decreased, right? And it's also going to mean that my tidal volume plus my expiratory reserve volume has decreased. And that, well, we'll talk about what that has to do with anything in a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself, okay? So, we know that tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume equals inspiratory capacity. Okay? We're going to worry about functional residual capacity in a minute. If I take my tidal volume plus my inspiratory reserve volume plus my expiratory reserve volume, that gives me my vital capacity. Why would I call that a vital capacity? Lincoln.
Is that because it's like the max amount you can breathe in and out?
Yes. It's the maximum amount of air, of oxygen and carbon dioxide that I can move at any one time. And if my vital capacity is reduced, what does that mean? What does that mean to my body if my vital capacity is reduced? Abigail.
That one of the three variables is off somewhere.
Yes, one of the three variables is off, but what is it going to do to my body, Sydney?
Less gas exchange.
Less gas exchange, which means I'm not going to get enough oxygen in, and I may not get enough carbon dioxide out. You know when you go to the doctor, they stick that little thing on your finger, and it comes back with a percentage. Usually a percentage is in the 90s. You know what they're measuring there?
Vital capacity.
They're measuring your oxygen content in your blood. If that oxygen content goes down, it is likely an indicator that your vital capacity has gone down. That you're having some sort of lung issue where you're not getting oxygen in. Okay? Now, if I take my tidal volume plus my inspiratory reserve volume plus my expiratory reserve volume plus my reserve volume, residual volume, what does that get me?
Your total lung capacity?
My total lung capacity. The total amount of air that my lung can hold. Someone who is a smoker, who has emphysema, are they likely to have a high total lung capacity or a low total lung capacity?
Low.
Low. They're going to have problems. If your total lung capacity is low, then your vital capacity is going to be low, which means you're going to have a hard time getting oxygen in. Now, this is a really big equation to remember. Tidal volume plus IRV plus ERV plus residual volume equals total lung capacity. How could I simplify that?
Could you just do like IRV to residual volume, like point an arrow? And
Well,
know that everything's between?
how so if I wanted to write this out, Bailey.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button.
Oh, that's
Vital capacity plus residual volume.
yes. These are vital capacity plus residual volume equals total lung capacity. Okay. I could also do functional residual capacity plus inspiratory capacity and get total lung capacity. Okay. There's 100 different ways to do these calculations. Your job is to make sure that you can label everything on this diagram and that you understand the relationships between the volumes and the capacities. Got it? Okay. Now, just in case this figure doesn't make you happy, I do this figure, which does exactly the same thing. Has the exact same information on it. Okay? So you need to make sure that you understand both of these figures, that you can look at one of these spirometry graphs and interpret what it's telling you. Got it? Okay. Caitlin, did I answer your question?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Now, measuring lung function, besides just looking at spirometry, there are a number of other things that you can measure. Okay? Respiratory rate, minute volume, alveolar ventilation, all of these things are definitions you need to know. That's it. I'm not going to ask you to do anything with them. You just need to know the definitions. Okay? Do you all understand the concept of partial pressure? Is there anybody who doesn't understand partial pressures? Because if you don't understand partial pressures, things are fixing to get really confusing. Okay.
Can you just go over them?
So partial pressure is basically the particular amount of pressure exerted by a specific gas within a mixture. So when you breathe in air, right, that air is going to contain some carbon dioxide, it's going to contain some oxygen, it's going to contain some nitrogen and a few other things, right? The partial pressure is the pressure of each of those gases. Okay? What we care about is what we call PO2, which is the partial pressure of oxygen, and PCO2, which is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Okay? As we start to look at diffusion, as we start to talk about actual gas exchange, one of the things we're going to be comparing is the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs to the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. Okay? And anytime the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs is greater than the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, then that oxygen is going to move down its gradient. Does that make sense? Okay. So if I have a partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the lungs, or in the blood, we'll say carbon dioxide in the blood, and then we're going to say that it's greater than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the lung, what does that tell me about what the carbon dioxide is going to do?
It's going to move from the blood to the lungs.
Yes, it is going to move from the blood to the lungs, because remember what I said earlier, gas will always move down the pressure gradient from the higher pressure to the lower pressure. Okay? Carbon dioxide doesn't care about what oxygen is doing. Carbon dioxide only cares about what its counterpart of carbon dioxide is doing. Okay? So if PCO2 is equal to PCO2, so we'll say blood and lungs, then what does that tell me about the movement of carbon dioxide? Do I have a pressure gradient here? No. If I don't have a gradient, am I going to have any net movement in one direction or the other? No, I'm not. It's going to move. Molecules are always moving, but basically what you're going to end up with is equal movement in both directions. You're not going to get a net exchange. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about that here in a minute, and it's going to be really important.
Yes. So in psychology,
Norma, Thursday. Okay. What do I have left here? All right. So, back a few minutes ago, we decided that if the thoracic cavity gets bigger, that the lungs would also get bigger, correct? Yes? Y'all agree with me? Okay. Now, I told you that in order to deal with moving air, we have to have pressures to compare, right? So the two pressures that we're going to work with are barometric atmospheric pressure and intra-alveolar pressure. Okay? Where would I measure barometric atmospheric pressure?
So that's just outside the body.
Yes, it is outside the body. where would I measure intraalveolar pressure?
In the alveoli?
In the alveoli, in the lungs, right? We'll just make it simple and say in the lungs, okay? So, if I have BAP out here, and I have IAP in here, okay? If barometric alveolar pressure is greater than intraalveolar pressure, what's going to happen to the air?
It's gonna move inside the lungs.
It is indeed going to move inside the lungs because air always travels down its concentration gradient, right? From high to low. So that would mean that if barometric alveolar pressure is less than intraalveolar pressure, then what's going to happen?
It's going to move from the alveola to the outside the body.
Yes, it's going to move out. Okay, so barometric alveolar pressure is greater than intraalveolar pressure. That tells me that I am doing inspiration or expiration.
Inspiration.
And barometric atmospheric pressure being less than intraalveolar pressure, there's too many A's and the I's and P's in there, means that I am doing what?
Expiration.
Expiration. Okay. This is how you ventilate. Okay? When air moves into your body, it is because the thoracic cavity has gotten bigger and the pressure in the thoracic cavity has gotten lower. Right? So let's look at this from another angle. If intraalveolar volume increases, then what happens to intraalveolar pressure?
It decreases.
It decreases, and that would mean that I am going to
Inspiration.
I'm going to inspire. I'm going to breathe in. And if intraalveolar volume decreases, then intraalveolar pressure increases, and I am going to expire or breathe out. Okay? So do you see these volume pressure relationships and how they come into play in this process? Okay, now, one of the things I want to point out, I'm going to shrink all this down because otherwise I will lose it. Come back here. I want to look at this separately. Go up there. All right. All right. So when I look at this, I see here that my alveoli have gotten bigger because my lungs have gotten bigger, because my thoracic cavity has gotten bigger, right? So my volume, my intraalveolar volume increased, which means that the intraalveolar pressure decreased and, air moves in. Right? Everybody see that? Is there anybody who doesn't see that? Okay. And down here, I see that my alveoli are getting smaller, which means that my intraalveolar volume has decreased, which means my intraalveolar pressure has increased, which means I'm going to push air out. What about these two other points? What about here and here? Why are there no arrows moving air?
Because the pressure is equal to each other in the alveoli and the barometric.
Yes, because at these 2 points, intraalveolar pressure equals barometric atmospheric pressure. Think about how you breathe, right? You don't breathe in and then immediately breathe out. There is a slight pause or a stop in that movement. Otherwise, you hyperventilate and pass out. Don't do that. I'm watching you. Stop it. No passing out in class. Okay? So that pause happens because the pressure reaches an equilibrium. When barometric pressure equals intraalveolar pressure, air stops moving. So you have to do a muscle contraction. Your muscles of expiration have to contract in order to start making that volume smaller so that the pressure goes up so that the air will then move again. Right? It's not something you do consciously, right? But it is something that happens. So it's important that you remember that there are points during the respiratory cycle where intraalveolar pressure and barometric pressure will equal each other and air will stop moving. Manny.
What causes you to yawn?
I'm not 100% sure about that. There are a couple of different hypotheses about it that I've heard of. One of them is a carbon dioxide issue where your body is low on oxygen, has too much carbon dioxide, and you need a rapid intake of oxygen. I've heard that it is literally a function of, how people say they're contagious. When somebody else yawns and you see them yawn, your brain thinks, oh, I must be short on oxygen too, so I need extra oxygen. There are a couple of different hypotheses. I honestly don't know. Lakin, did you have a question? Or an answer to the question?
I just had a sarcastic answer, being tired.
Yeah, well, that would be the reason I've been doing it all day long.
Not the anatomical.
Caitlin, did you have something to add?
First day of psychology in high school, we actually talked about this. And some psychologists think that it's like, so animals, they do it to keep each other like accountable and aware whenever there's, or to like make sure that they're watching for predators and stuff. So there's also that theory that we do that, and like when we yawn in response to someone else yawning, like it's like that keeping aware.
Sending the signals. Yeah. I think animals yawn because they're tired. I watch my dog walk around yawning all the time. Usually right before he goes to sleep. All right. I've lost my ability to... Come on, catch up, computer. You can do it. Okay. So I think what we're going to do, because we're down to, I don't know, like 11 slides or something. Less than that, maybe. I think we're going to finish this on Thursday. I'm going to let you guys go early, and we'll finish this on Thursday. And hopefully, by the time we finish on Thursday, you will have a solid grasp of the respiratory system. Any questions?
I just had a question about the why the reading was like all due yesterday.
Not sure.
Yeah, the last 2 weeks, all of the readings have been due Monday.
Oh, you should have said something. I will, I'll extend those. I mean, I assume you've probably finished them all, but you should have emailed me about that because that was not supposed to be the case.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, I was just wondering. I was like, oh my gosh.
It's
I'm
that
going
time in the
back.
it's that time in the semester where my brain has started to, give up. So, yeah. That should not have been. Anytime you see that, let me know. Okay?
Have a good day.
You too. Have a good one.
Hey, Dr. Metcalf.
Yes.
Are you gonna post a participation question
Link? Yes. Yes, I will do that right now.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yep.